Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to join us for the IHEAM North East Branch webinar from Newcastle upon Tyne hospitals on the delivery of the North East Nightingale Hospital. My name is Gavin Evans, and I'm the Deputy Director of Estates here at Newcastle Hospitals. Joining me in this morning's presentation will be Russell Jones, Head of Strategy, Planning and Capital Development here at Newcastle Hospitals and lead for the delivery of the Nightingale project. Steve Church, Contracts Manager at Tolent Construction, Principal Contractor for the project, and Neal Robinson, Managing Director of Geoffrey Robinson Limited, responsible for the mechanical and electrical installation. This morning's presentation should last approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by 15 minutes of questions. We will be using the questions function to take questions throughout the presentation, and this can be found at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Unfortunately, we won't have time to use the audience hand up facility as part of this morning's presentation, so please post your questions and our speakers will answer as many questions as there is time for at the end of the session. Please note that a certificate of attendance will be sent to all those who watch the live webinar in its entirety. We request that no part of this webinar is reproduced and published in print or any other format. So to the presentation itself. By way of overview, we will look at the project brief, the approach taken, and the challenges of the construction before looking at how assurance was provided throughout the project. Sorry, just waiting for the next slide to appear. So then, why was it needed? Following the first case of COVID-19 in Wuhan in December 2019, the world changed quickly. First came the escalating numbers in China, followed by the footage of the construction of the Fangchang field hospitals in mid-January before their subsequent opening on the 5th of February. In the UK, the first positive cases were transferred to the highly contagious and infectious diseases unit here at the RVI of Newcastle City Hospitals on the 31st of January. The number of COVID positive cases then continued to increase throughout February, leading to a letter from Sir Simon Stevens and Amanda Pritchard on the 17th of March to all NHS trusts, highlighting the fact that the NHS was likely to come under intense pressure and tasking trusts with maximising the availability of critical care beds for an expected peak in or around the 17th of April. With all of the trusts then in the region having followed this instruction and modelled the maximum critical care capacity that could be surged to through the use of recovery areas and theatres for critical care beds, for example, early modelling anticipated that at the peak the region would still be short by up to 300 to 500 critical care beds. With this in mind, under the direction of NHS England, Newcastle hospitals were tasked with the design, construction and mobilisation of a new hospital to provide this additional capacity. It was to be similar to that of the London Nightingale, which had started planning on the 21st of March and was included in Matt Hancock's briefing on the 24th of the same month. The understanding was always that the facility would only become operational on the agreement of NHS England and NHS Trust chief executives within the region. So this presentation then will hopefully take you through how we took a warehouse and in 3 weeks transformed that empty warehouse into a hospital of 20 wards and 460 beds.
Okay, so hope you can all hear me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brief and what the challenge was that we were all up against. But just to confirm, it was around about 500 beds, but this was prior to any design of pen to paper that we looked at in the space we had. We were looking at level 1, 2 and 3 in terms of level of care, including ventilated critical care beds. We were looking to peak or the North East was looking to peak in the pandemic around Easter weekend, which left a 2-week programme, which was very tight. We were looking to provide facilities that were safe and clean, and critically they were to be run as an extension to our main acute sites within the trust. As you would expect, patient safety was at the forefront, and we had to achieve standards where possible, HPNs, British standards, etc. But I've just highlighted the novel coronavirus guidance that came out in the March of the same year, and what became apparent pretty much straight away was if we were to follow that guidance to the letter, then we would achieve nowhere near the 500 beds that were needed. It was somewhere down at the 300 mark. So we used the guidance as a guide, but we used our own experiences and expertise within the trust. So a quick overview of the scheme timeline, just some key dates to pick out. So 23rd was the call to our chief executive, Dame Jackie Daniel, from Richard Barker, can we help? The next few days were finding a venue, and once we found that venue, we all met on the 28th of March on site with an initial floor plan which had been produced only 24 hours earlier. We met on site, we discussed ways forward. We started on site that weekend on the 29th. We quickly produced a mock-up room, and then the next phase, sort of from the 1st of April all the way through, a little bit stop-start before we gained actual confirmation to press on at full speed on the 9th of April. Some other key dates: 15th of April was when we received the service specification agreements, and then on the same day, Sky News, the first tweet that found its way on Twitter, sort of the first bit of press coverage for the Nightingale site. All the way through to the 23rd of April, where we'd fully cleaned down and completed construction. And the period from then on, it was around about snagging and enabling, and to finally get our confirmation letter on the 1st of May that the facility was approved, which led to the 5th of May to open the unit itself. So a quick look at the structure and approach, how we approach this as an organisation, right from NHS improvement down through Newcastle upon Tyne Hospital's Trust Board and Surge Command in the North East. And a whole raft of structure up on your screen there of all the people who were involved. It just shows you how detailed this thing was. I've highlighted in red, which is our specific estate structure, which we'll come on to in more detail, but a huge amount of people involved and a huge amount of governance put in place. So how do we do it from estates? Well, we met on a daily basis as a construction team with our main construction main contractor being Tolent and Geoffrey Robinson and our capital team, and feeding into a daily Nightingale OPCO on-site meeting with some key personnel, which I've highlighted there on the blue bubble. We had Hannah Powell, who was the Nightingale Director of Ops, Dr. Reid Nesbitt, who was the clinical director, Gordon Elder, the Director of Nursing, Louise Birch, who was the IP&C lead, Dan Sims, who was the Programme Director, and Rob Lees, who was the nitty-gritty boots on the feet of project manager for the scheme. So those people were key to decision making on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just go back a step to when we first got to know about this, we as an estates department. So we first found out about the scheme on the 27th of March, and the question straight away, who's going to do this for us? We had P22 on site, but we discounted it for various reasons, and we used a local North East framework, using contractors who we knew we could work with, who knew we could get the job done. We produced an outline cost plan pretty much straight away that would be used contractually throughout the project as a target cost. We established capital teams and structures and how we were going to do it. And then on the 28th, we met on site as a team led by Martin Wilson, our Chief Operating Officer, with a copy of an initial floor plan in hand. And it was a real sort of call to arms type day of, setting the scene, huge challenge in front of us, how we were going to do it. And it was positivity right from day one. I think that set the scene all the way through the project. So we had that first day on site to meet people who were involved, who were going to do it, and we started brainstorming about the who's, the whys, and the whats. There's some early work packages to progress. We needed a brief, and certainly IP&C would be at the forefront of what that brief was. Contract admin, how we were going to run it. We chose NEC3 option C, which is open book. Design intent, and I know Neal will come on to more about the M&E challenges of the project, but it was probably going to be more down to what could we achieve, not what we would want to achieve. And again, specifications, what might be available. We knew we were up against it. We had a 2-week program. Would we get any intelligence from other Nightingale sites? We didn't know, so we might have to make a lot of our own decisions. We'd need obviously risk register, and how we were going to run this as a site, and how we were going to keep our governance structure up and record keeping. So all of these decisions came out of those initial discussions. You know, how we were going to run it on a day-to-day basis, lines of communication, all of these questions, you know, you having to come up with when you're actually on site and starting the job. We knew that authorizing engineers were going to be key to the scheme, and we were to use our own trust appointments, so an extension to our existing estates. Infection control approvals, and we had links through Louise Birch on site to our director of infection prevention and control. We knew we'd have to derogate from standards, but how we were going to record it and to what level would we derogate from, and link that to risk. And then how were we going to deliver the actual build, the working patterns. This obviously had to be a 24/7 operation, but just how on earth we were going to do it. So all of this led to us pulling an estates project quality plan together. We had issue logs per discipline. Every decision was logged, who made it, why. We had a daily trust and contractor progress meetings. Sometimes that was twice daily, and again that fed up into OPCO later on in the afternoon. Design development meetings and how we would capture that design development. I think from memory, it was about 20 iterations of the floor plans. As it just moved on so quickly on a daily basis as we were solving problems. I'm sure Tolent will come on to that in the presentation. Derogations from standards was really important. You know, what standards have we derogated from? Why did we choose to derogate? And who made that decision? And what was the risk-based methodology behind that? And then our EE reports and our EE involvements was going to be key. So we knew from day one that that estates project quality plan would provide the assurance to NHSEI should it be needed later on in the project, and it stand us in good stead. So then onto the design of the unit. Now I'll focus solely on sort of layout and building design, if you like. Neal will cover M&E. So we didn't bring an architect on board. We used solely the expertise of in-house teams and our own capital teams, certainly relying on or leaning on Dr. Nesbitt, who has huge experience in this field. So rather than just get a warehouse and throw as many beds in there as we possibly could fit in, you know, we sort of peeled back the pages a little bit of where do we start? Well, it's goods in, goods out. It's donning and doffing areas for the staff safety, how we contain the virus within the main ward areas. Talking about patient flow, but this is all before we got down to number of beds. But how were they going to nurse it? Was this one big open field hospital? Was this wards? What was the split between wards and ICU? So those were the initial questions we got, and then produced the design from there. Certainly leaning on support functions and colleagues through supplies, pharmacy, EME, all with a huge role to play. What was the fire strategy in terms of means of escape? And Gavin will come on to a little bit about that and how that developed as the project went on. And then all the time in terms of design, thinking about how we were going to maintain this, access to valves, everything else that you would have in a normal hospital. But I think the one thing that was at the forefront right from the start is we knew there wasn't going to be a ceiling in the big open plan area, so we knew that would have problems or sort of technical issues with the M&E design further down the line. So I wanted to talk a little bit about producing a 2-bed bay mock-up area right from the start. This was that first weekend, and it stood us in real good stead for giving assurance to NHSEI as to why we derogated slightly from the COVID guidance. So we mapped out a standard 28-bed ward, and we mapped up a 2-bed unit. So we were going to create these wards in 2-bed pods. And what that did was give the clinical teams and the nursing staff who were there that weekend an opportunity to talk about patient observation, where staff bases would be, wash hand basin positions to infection control, just how many beds we could fit in there, were the bed centres achievable, and it gave us that level of assurance that this was the right thing to do before we just swept away and started constructing all the bedded areas. So this, if I can just, I've jumped ahead of myself, sorry. That's the final design. So the two blue areas are the 330 beds, 6 wards top, 6 wards below. The red area to the right is 8 wards of ICU beds. And then the central spine through the middle was all the support services, so storerooms, clean utilities, drug rooms. And we had the 4 external dirty utilities, which Tolent will talk about. Certainly from an infection control point of view, there was a necessity to have those outside of the building. So right from top was goods in, goods out from the top of the slide there, and that was the flow through, and then Donna and Doffin and offices are to the right. But just drilling down in a little bit more detail, on the left-hand side is a typical ward, a 28-bed ward set up. There was a couple of fluctuations on a couple of the bays, but access from the top, 5 wash-hand basins, nurse station, and then 4 banks of beds with a central spine down the middle for access, and then fire escapes at the bottom. On the right-hand side is a typical ICU of 17 beds, where we had access from the left, wash-hand basins at the entrance, 4 wash-hand basins, 2 at the bottom end, and then a central nurse station. And then lastly for me, just some key stakeholders in terms of who was involved in the design, the construction, and then the facilities management. So, architecturally ourselves, Geoffrey Robinson led M&E design and construction. ME Systems designed the metal gases, and some real input from all our authorising engineers who existing appointments within the trust. And I'm sure we'll come on to the design and build through Tolent and Geoffrey Robinson as we progress.
So then, fire safety and the fire strategy. So one of the things that'd be worth pointing out, I suppose, at the early stage, is that unlike most of the Nightingale facilities, which have made use of existing conference centre style buildings such as the XL in London, or more locally the Yorkshire and Humber at Nightingale at Harrogate, the North East Nightingale was located in an industrial property. So as a result of that, it clearly lacked the usual fire protection measures that you'd expect to see, such as compartmentation, protected escape routes, and L1 fire alarm systems. It was also clear that the time frames that Russell's already alluded to precluded the works necessary to meet the requirements of HTMO 5 fire code or to achieve the proper building control certification for change of use. One good example of this being the installation of a sprinkler system, which, although it would undoubtedly have enhanced the safety of the building, there was no way a system of the size required could be designed, procured and installed without causing a significant delay to the project. This being the case then, it was clear that we'd need to use an engineered approach, and that meant that we needed to start the engagement process at the earliest opportunity. In that we were lucky that the Sunderland Building Control team were already engaged with the project, and through connections David Gill, our Strategic Fire Safety Officer, had with the local fire and rescue service, we were quickly able to identify the right representatives for a working group. Also included in that working group, obviously, were Tolent as the principal contractor, and Ryan McCready of Olson Fire and Risk Consulting, who was Newcastle Hospital's authorising engineer for fire. Now, he was invaluable due to his, in part, to his company's involvement in other Nightingale hospitals, including the Glasgow Louisa Jordan Hospital, which is in the Glasgow SCC Centre, and just the information that he could bring about decisions that had been made elsewhere that had worked, or maybe those that hadn't. So, as I say, it was clear from the outset that we wouldn't achieve formal sign-off for the project, and so it was essential that we implemented the use of a project log to track all of the decisions made, the derogations and the justifications behind them. With all of the decisions that were made, there was a very real understanding, however, should the facility be required come the expected peak in cases, that any delay to that project would be costly. That said, it was also understood that any potential fire would be catastrophic. So this being the case, having the decision log as a way of communicating the reasons behind the decisions to all of the partner organisations, the fire service, planning, building control, was essential. It also had the added benefit of later forming the basis of the fire strategy for the site and the associated fire safety management procedures. With regards to the strategy itself, unlike a number of the other sites that were using defend in place, largely due to the complexity of the buildings that they were in, the complexity of moving the number of non-ambulatory patients who would be oxygen dependent, we decided that for the Nightingale Hospital North East, we were going to look at a phased horizontal evacuation strategy, albeit one that didn't benefit from proper compartmentation. So this being the case, in regards to the open plan, single-storey nature of the treatment area, it actually made life a lot easier, with minimal alterations required to the existing layouts to allow clear routes to the final exits, and also minor alterations to the final exits for allow use for them with beds. As you'll note from the majority of the wards shown on the plan, they already had dual exits leading onto multiple routes of escape in the event of a fire. The greatest area of concern then was that of the level 3 critical care, or the ICU area, which is the dark grey shaded area to the right-hand side of the floor plan. This area only had a single point of exit from the ward onto the corridor. In order to mitigate that, a novel arrangement was pulled together for the design of the bedhead outlets, which saw the medical gas outlets double stacked on top of each other, allowing for a door set to be installed behind the bedhead. You can see that in the elevation sketch shown at the bottom of the slide. With this additional door set in place, we could then provide a secondary corridor of sorts through the back of the ward that alleviated, to an extent, the dead end issue. In addition to those alterations, we also enclosed all of the high-risk rooms on the central spine, such as the storerooms and electrical switch rooms, in 60-minute compartments, and installed an L1 addressable fire alarm system throughout. Following the issue of the design note for COVID wards for intubated patients on the 22nd of March, the decision was also made to install fixed oxygen monitoring in each of the wards. Although it must be said, the opinion of the authorising engineers were that due to the volume and construction of the building, the incorporated air changes, it was unlikely that enrichment would become an issue. So although the construction of the facility had a major part to play in its fire safety, it could be argued that the harder aspect was actually the design of the fire safety management plan and the agreement of the roles and responsibilities within it. Now, this was largely due to the unknown nature of the staffing model. As Ross was alluded to with his structure, there were a huge number of different people involved coming from different organisations, and that was only expected to worsen should the hospital go into full use, with over 2,000 members of staff being poured in from trusts across the region. For that reason, we needed to ensure that we had a very detailed fire safety management plan in place, that it had been agreed and all senior managers were aware, and also importantly that they had these immediate action cards so that everybody on that role was clear and aware of what they would have to do as part of an evacuation. The most complex part being how you'd manage the evacuation with senior members of staff in the management area separated from the treatment area, and how you would keep the potentially contagious patients separate. So that was all done and then rolled into a training package that was be delivered by the fire safety team to what we were expecting to be in the region of 2,000 members of staff. Luckily, that training never had to be delivered.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the mechanical and electrical services. It's a subject I could talk about for well over my allotted time, so I'm going to have to try and keep it as brief as possible. So the timescale that's been mentioned already is incredibly quick. We met on the 28th and literally started the next day. The enthusiasm to support such a scheme was truly amazing. All my colleagues, everybody pitched in from the whole company. It was something to be seen. So the challenges that we sort of had to achieve, let's move this on. The first problem, physically supporting the services. How can we get across such a huge factory without affecting the ward space? This would be critical to the programme, and getting the suspended structure up and in place would be the key to the services solution. Current electrical and gas loads. Do we have enough of either to satisfy a hospital environment? In simple, we don't. We contacted the gas shipper in the morning of the first meeting on site and let them know our intention, and literally within 2 to 3 hours they had somebody on site and they increased the gas load to give us what we now needed to satisfy the calculations. The electrical solution will be a little bit more complicated, and I'll go on to that in a minute. So now we have the required gas load. How can we heat such a large volume? What can actually be achieved? Initially, the whole scope was what can be done and do it as quickly as you can. However, as the design progressed, this changed significantly. So how are we going to heat such a vast expanse? And what are we actually going to heat, given the high headroom and the lack of ceiling to keep the heat in? Procurement, bearing in mind the whole country is shutting down, where can we buy the equipment to do it at such short notice? Can we break with HTM protocol and install alternative products if we can't get what is required and what is available in time to complete it? Is this going to be acceptable to the Trust's authorising engineers? And who's going to be responsible for signing it all off? So on the electrical side, obviously the hospital demands are significant and differ ever so slightly to a factory unit. A belt and braces approach is needed, and we need resilience, and we need it now. At one point, we had over 60 electricians working day shift and a further 30 working night shift to pull everything in to try and get it done in time. Working alongside our other trades, taking the numbers on site to over 200 M&E installers within a 24-hour period, all working hand in hand within the construction teams. So if we look at the actual electrical generation and standby loads, you can see that we actually brought in Aggreko solution for temporary generators. We actually installed an additional transformer, and it all had to be done remarkably quickly, as sort of detailed in the sketch there below. The other thing we had to consider was the fire protection. So we brought in our supply chain, and again, we had the buy-in from them. They were there on site literally the next day. Fire detection alarms were installed everywhere to full hospital specification. Fire stopping was carried out in-house, along with external assistance because of the vast quantity of it and the speed it had to be done. We carried out all penetrations, mainly on a night shift when the factory was quiet, but it was something to be seen. So on the medical gases side, this was obviously the biggest concern for the Trust. Oxygen is in really short supply. Making sure we had the equipment to do it was going to be a challenge. We brought in our supply chain, who had access to an alternative supplier that would not normally be used by this Trust. And at the very early stages, a design was quickly pulled together with the Trust AE, and a new external plant room was built on site and assembled with all the required vacuum plant and medical gas treatment plant ready to go live. Oxygen was the only real item of concern given the required demand across the whole country, and it probably was the last bit of kit that actually turned up to be installed. So on the next problem we had to sort of encounter was the domestic services. Water storage resilience. We need to have enough water for each of the wards in the event of a mains failure. Given the timescales, the largest tank we could get in short notice was 72,000 litre tank. From this, we would need to pump the water across the factory, feeding each of the wards with duty and standby pumps, again giving full resilience in the event of a failure. Hot water was going to be another challenge. How would we actually provide hot water to all of these basins? So it was decided the easiest way to do this was point of use electric water heaters, and we use these at each of the sinks. The downside would be the ever increasing electrical load that this would bring. Then there is the drainage of all these sinks. These sinks are in the middle of a factory floor, so how would we get all this wastewater away? So the only viable solution for this was a Saniflow underbasin pump system, which we ran to the drainage system above the bed ward areas and ran away to the outside walls. It was the only viable solution, I think. So the biggest challenge would be the heating and ventilation, as I mentioned earlier. So to me, this was the greatest challenge. We managed to track down a shipment of gas-fired warm air heaters that were destined for Pinewood Studios in London. They agreed to let us buy the heaters to give us a robust solution. These heaters would give us the option to run high and low fire and provide a vast amount of air, which obviously with COVID is a good requirement. Because we were blowing warm air in, we would also need to look at getting that air out of the building. Initially, we were not looking too carefully at whether it should be positive or negative pressure within the ward spaces. As the design progressed, it became clear that the truss AE would require a negative pressure environment, and this led to a new problem of how to get suitable fans to remove such a huge quantity of air and what to do with it. Is it contaminated? Do we need to filter it? How do we deal with replacing dirty filters in an environment that was going to be tough to get access to? Large fans and HEPA filters were installed outside the building to resolve this issue. They could then be maintained without anybody actually having to go into the factory and swap, and obviously the HEPA filtration could be changed over as and when required. These exhaust ducts were then run to high level to make sure there was no risk to the public of any contaminated air bypassing the filters, and we had a chimney effect at sort of 3 to 4 meters above where the fans were situated. Following further design development, it was decided that the donning and doffing area would also require a separate environmental with a slightly increased pressure, so the air would flow from the offices through the don and doffing room back into the factory where the contaminated air would be exhausted to atmosphere. We need to look at the donning and doffing area because they were going to require a separate heating solution because the gas-fired heaters were just for the ward area. So we actually went for an electrical system to blow warm air in and extracting warm air out, but creating a pressure that would flow through into the contaminated area. And that is me for that part. I'll pass you on to Steve.
Thanks, Neil. So the construction solution, the programme, as we've made reference to there, was one that was delivered over 3 weeks. The initial weekend, myself, Neil and his colleagues, we spent brainstorming, talking about partition solutions, how best to logistically bring the services to within the ward spaces. The shift patterns themselves were over a 24/7 period with 3 management teams on rotation. The scheme peaked at over 250 operatives working across various different disciplines. Tolent providing the construction solution, we went out to our specialist supply chain, and given the nature of this building with its centralised steel spine that held the 2 overhead cranes, we chose to sublet elements of the build to our 2 key suppliers, in that we would have 2 flooring contractors, 2 partition contractors, 2 painting contractors, and we segregated the building 50-50. It made for quite a harmonious, friendly rivalry as they raced one another to try and reach completion at the other end of the factory. The central area between the adjacent wards, or what we term the service spine, this was the walls that were back to back within the ward spaces. Can't really stress enough importance on how that expedited the construction solution. It enabled us to build out the wards, tape and joint them, paint them, install the electrical services and indeed the flooring strategy, whilst the MEP solution was still able to progress throughout these service spines. Something that if you were doing this project again, it's certainly a key lesson learned. The basin solution there that you can see on your left, this building was only accessible on the east side, where it had the dock level as the vehicle access. So we could only access 50% of the building before logistically we had to transit materials underneath that central steel spine that I mentioned about. The programme itself, we would work out of the ICU areas that Russell will have touched upon earlier, and we worked out towards what's classed as Bay 0102 within the normal ward areas. We just had to be conscious that we had to not become landlocked in the building because there was external attenuation. So it wasn't a building that could be accessed 360 degrees. The M&E solution that Neal made reference to there, that was undertaken. They started 2 days in advance of us. We had our engineers setting out all the partitions to the millimetre, so Neal's lattice sections of steel work that were going to support all the services were constructed in exactly the right position and the right height. Some of the construction key challenges, as you can imagine, we were at a point whereby construction suppliers had furloughed staff that had begun to close down. So it was only through those key relationships we had with our supply chain where some of these guys remained open and would supply the site with whether it be welfare, partitions, paint. It was becoming a struggle. Materials such as vinyl, there had been some work done prior to us being engaged on the process, and some vinyl and some other materials were held in stock. Materials, once they got word of the Nightingale, as you can imagine, it was a real call to arms, and a number of suppliers really were looking to be involved in this scheme. So whereby originally builders merchants and such was closing down, it really gained momentum and everybody wanted to be a part of it. It's worthwhile noting that the supply chain that we used on the contract were tried and tested. They'd worked on a number of healthcare projects, and we just knew that they had that long-standing relationship and that they would come through for us. What was quite challenging was the building was new. It had just recently been constructed, and we were not yet in possession with the O&M manuals or the as-built drawings. So for instance, all of the services that were going to be hung from the roof, we had to get independent calculations, engage structural engineers to ensure that the service solution could be met. There was currently no off-site drainage when we took over the site. There was an off-site pumping station that wasn't currently commissioned, so everything was tankered on site and water was brought in. As I mentioned there, the structural design, one of the key challenges, could the roof, as in its current situation, could that support all this drainage, the network of ductwork? The scope creep, that there was the fluid design. From day one on the site, we engaged our supply chain, as indeed the NHS was talking with their key suppliers to ensure that any design changes were incorporated, and these were incorporated at a pace where at 9 o'clock in the morning changes might be introduced, and by 10 o'clock you could see the practical results out on the works interfaces. Another key challenge was that during the build process there was a number of days where the project was stopped and then recommenced, as we didn't know whether or not it would be seen through to completion. But the supply chain, they all remained positive and stayed with us throughout. The building finishes solution, well, as I said, it was one that it really was a coordinated solution, and it was something to be proud of. In appearance and conformity, I think with the exception of a ceiling space within the facility, it was a true hospital in every sense of the terms, with the floors all uniform, anti-slip, walls, antibacterial paint supplied, doors, laminated doors, and the cabinetry and the IPS panels all laminated, and the acoustics I'll touch upon in a moment. So as I mentioned there, the partition solution, we went with a traditional partition solution that could be constructed in favour of some of the other O2s that went with a freestanding solution, partly because we didn't have the facility to put the services within an underfloor suspended floor. We had to suspend these from the ceiling, and we were concerned about the robustness of the temporary solutions that were being offered elsewhere to simply support the services. And just another note there that the building fabric modifications, much the same as the structural requirements to hang services from the ceiling. There were hundreds of penetrations to be undertaken for the MEP services, each one requiring primary and secondary steel modifications to be procured and installed. The building logistics, as I touched upon, we could only get vehicle access to 50% of the building before we had to then use mini forklifts to transport materials. A key consideration at the start was we procured a number of welfare, toilet, shower block facilities to expedite the programme, and we situated them around the perimeter of the building. And as I touched upon there, that one thing that was clearly apparent, because we were operating in a factory area, the acoustics and reverberation was something that we had to address late on in the scheme, and we turned around a full acoustic solution with calculations in 2 or 3 days and had that installed. Just a final slide there on underpinning success. It really was a scheme of true collaboration, team spirit, problem solving, communication, motivation to the cause was unquestionable, and it was always one of challenges, not problems. I think the spirit on the scheme was something Tolent have never encountered on any construction scheme, and I doubt I'll see ever again. It really was quite spectacular, with a can-do attitude through every team member throughout. There'll now be a short time-lapse video showing the scheme from its concept through to completion.
So over to me again on NHSI EI assurance. So you've delivered the hospital over 3 intense weeks with no sleep, huge team effort, and then you've got to get it over the line now with providing assurance to NHS EI that it's safe, and it can be opened as a facility. The first thing I would say that the process wasn't to try and trip anybody up. It was very professional. It was very well organised. It was over a period of a presentation by the trust and a period of questions and answering throughout the day, and then information taken away and questions come back. So that's the first thing to say. And it was led by NHSCI through ARCUS was the vehicle. And some of the things that the trust had to provide assurance on were the design brief and the strategy and the sign-off process, our project quality plan, given assurance that we work to all host trust policies and procedures, and particularly the use of authorising engineers. A key document was our approach to derogations, how we approached them, what we did, how we risk assessed it, and who made those decisions. And I think that we did a really good job on that, and that our approach to derogations document was shared nationally to some of the other Nightingale sites to help others in their process. We had to show good cost control, that we had risk assessments for water, ventilation, etc. Our commission records are up to date. Did we have utility resilience for the site in terms of water and electricity? And then how are we going to maintain and run this facility? So a real intense process, but one that was handled really well, and one that we came out of with flying colours, I guess. I think from a lessons learned point of view, moving forward to doing something like this again, none of this was known at the outset of what would be challenged on. It was really only down to sort of good governance from our trust and our estates departments, of second guessing to a certain degree what would be requested and in what form, and just showing good governance and sort of good record keeping. But we got through it, and eventually on the back of that, NHSCI signed the process off.
So then, in use. And although Newcastle Hospitals were identified as the lead organisation for the delivery of the Nightingale Hospital, there was always a clear understanding that due to the expected level of activities on the RVI and Freeman sites, that the Estates Department would not have the capacity to maintain them as an ongoing basis. So this being the case, and as part of the philosophy we have here at Newcastle Hospitals about partnering, particularly across the region, a partnership agreement was made with Untitled Solutions of Cumbria, Northumberland, Tyne and Wear NHS Foundation Trust to provide the on-site hard and particularly soft services. With the soft FM alone, it required them to bring on 40 additional members of staff just to maintain it. If it had then gone into full occupation, they would then have had to recruit further. Also, we've got to tip our hats here to Choice of South Tyneside and Sunderland NHS Foundation Trust, as they then took on the specific responsibility for the maintenance of the medical gases due to the availability and authorised persons and competent persons that they had. So worth kind of just pointing out here that although it never really went into full use, it was a facility that had to be maintained so that it could be stood up with 10 days notice. So that was 10 days to get the system, the building fully up and working, and bring in all of those staff from across the region and deliver the massive amount of training that would need to be done. So from that point of view, the building was always maintained live, and it had to have an ongoing assurance model with NTW reporting via the assurance groups that Newcastle Hospitals already have in place. For example, the water safety group or the medical gas safety group. This oversight, as Russell has already mentioned, was then maintained through the authorising engineers, who again did their regular reporting on and regular audit of the facility, as if they were doing for one of the other hospital sites. And just to wrap up, I suppose it's the hospital never did go into operation as a COVID hospital, but it certainly has been used for the delivery of vaccinations across the region. Designed to handle up to 3 pods, it's currently got 2 in use, and will be surging up to 3 later on as the demand requires. So it's nice that we never had to use the facility, but it is still getting some benefit towards the pandemic. So that's the end of our presentation. We'll now move on to the questions section, and by magic, there are a few that have popped in. So if I could just ask the speakers to turn their cameras and microphones on, I'll just ask as they appear, if that's okay. So first question I've got here then, so what were the main lessons learned from the project that could potentially assist in future pandemics?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Gavin. I think I sort of touched on it on that last slide with the assurance. Is I think as a NHS organisation, NHS estates, we need to have some sort of plan if this thing's to happen again, as to how we'd engage, how we'd start these things up, what procurement routes we would use, but more around the assurance of what will be required from the host trusts. I think had we known that from the start, we might have done things a little bit differently, but it was certainly relying on the expertise of the trusts and the competence of the trusts, knowing what was going to be requested of them. I think is what I would say to that.
Anything else to add? No. So moving on to the next question then, a technical one. So with the lack of ceilings, how did you calculate the air volumes required to be provided to the treatment area?
Okay, I can take that one, I suppose. Andrew Poplet was the Trust's authorising engineer, and he kind of drove how he wanted to view it. So the initial concept was we were going to have to look at the entire volume of air, but Andrew sort of fudged the figures maybe slightly to say that we could actually drop the grills down to below what would have been a ceiling level, and allow that to be a new volume for working out the air changes.
Okay, thank you. So it's just worth jumping in there from a fire perspective. I know that from the evacuation point of view, the lack of ceilings certainly gave us a positive because of the smoke well that it allowed, so that additional time that it gave to carry out the escape without the build-up of smoke. So it had its positives as well as its challenges, I suppose. Another one here. So what was the biggest challenge to be overcome on the project? I suppose there were a few in there, but who'd like to take that question on?
For me, it was available deliveries, what you could get. It was the whole country was shutting down. It's what was available in the time we had. What about you, Steve? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, it was one that was very similar. We luckily we managed to exhaust the supplies that were held within builders merchants, but I do know we got quite close to exhausting the entire North East with regards plasterboard, for instance.
Yeah, I think for me it was the overall timeline. I mean, this was the epitome of design and build. This was, design today, start tomorrow, and deliver in 2 weeks. So I think that was something that we'll never see again. And the outcome we've achieved in 2 to 3 weeks with a couple of delays in there was phenomenal, really.
Yeah.
So the next one, this is an interesting one actually. I'd be intrigued to know the answer to this one. So the design changes, how were they controlled and prioritised? So I suppose it goes back to what you were saying earlier on in the presentation about the number of revisions there were of the floor plans. I think you mentioned 20 odd. So it's how do you separate out? At what point does project creep become too far and you're delaying the project? How did you manage that situation?
Yeah, well, I say there's lots of changes, but there were lots of individual small changes as the design progressed. So the basis of 20 wards in an ICU area, numbers of beds, never changed from that first issue drawn. It was mainly things around positions of support units and clean utilities that came from it. And how we did that, we certainly worked with the lead clinicians and the director of nursing and infection prevention control. None of those decisions were taken without those people making those decisions, and that was done on a daily basis at either our estates meeting or a bespoke estates meeting with infection control or up through OPCO, and recorded on our quality assurance plan. And that it could be right from moving a door somewhere to an additional clean utility or dirty utility that was needed. So everything was documented, and everything that was made sure infection control passed it on, and if it couldn't be answered by infection control, it would go to the director of infection prevention control.
And just to add to that, from the site point of view, we had meetings twice a day just to agree what was going to be done and what was the next challenge to be overcome.
Lovely. Okay, I think it's certainly one of the things that came out from the presentation throughout is communication here. Is that the speed of communication, the regular meetings, the identification of key roles and responsibilities across that organisational chart that you brought up at the start of the presentation, Russell. It's about that kind of identifying who and then how you communicate with them seems to have come out quite well.
Yeah, and it was also a good use of our in-house capital team. You know, we had Rob Lee's, the nuts and bolts project manager on the ground working with Geoffrey Robinson and Tolent. I sort of led on the design element and the assurance in the background. So, and we had other Keith and transport teams, and Colin Addison, for example, did the mortuary. So we all fed into each other, and it was one point of contact with lots of individual lines of communication feeding in.
Okay. Last question, I think it is. I've got it. So, were there any specific challenges of working 24 hours? I don't know, Steve, Neil, whether that's a question for yourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tackle that one first. I mean, the challenges were such that you needed that volume of workforce to then rotate. But likewise in construction, we had the managerial capacity to compensate with that with the construction sites that couldn't operate through the lack of materials. So those gentlemen were drafted in and utilised on the scheme, and likewise with subcontractors. No one was working 24 hours. It was strictly 2 or 3 shifts working on a rotation.
Yeah, and I think that just to add to that, the feel-good factor that was driven behind the project, it just, everybody wanted to be involved. There was nobody that didn't come to work that didn't want to be there. So it was a really good atmosphere to work in.
So, as I say, that was the last question, but there is a final thing on it, and it's from Graham Salmon. So, Graham, I thank you for this. So it's not a question, but a congratulation. I volunteer at North East Nightingale and have been able to see the massive scale of the undertaking. The facilities are well received by everyone who walks through the door. That's certainly something I'd second from my perspective. It was a massive project, and I'd certainly like to give my thanks to Neal, Russell, Steve, for the work that they put in as part of that project, and getting it off the ground in the timeframes given was a miracle. So thank you, gentlemen, for yourselves and all the work that you put in. And I'd also just like to say thank you for the presentation. Went very well, and guys, thank you for carrying the load, I think I'd say there. So that then brings us to the end of our presentation and of the questions for today. Thank you very much for attending.